I want to start off by saying all of this happened in 2011 in Siberia, Russia, very thickly wooded. I am going to relay as much info as possible, without giving any info on mission objectives at the time. You may be wondering why there were Americans in Russia, but that is a question I'd rather not answer. At the time, I was in the Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command, or MARSOC. Beginning the story, my team was split up into 2 squads at the time, into 2 groups of 7. We were to rally back up into a team at camp, so me and my squad of 6 were not expecting any resistance. We did not have our weapons drawn. Approaching a cliff with a couple 100-foot drop, we started surveying the area below and noticed the small town in the forest below that was not mapped. After calling it in, we were given an order to make our way to this town to investigate. As we hiked, we noticed the trail along the ridge that would double time to the bottom of the cliff and made the decision to take it. After we were halfway down the trail, we heard a bellowing howl above us that almost made me lose balance. It didn't sound like a wolf at all. We looked back up the trail and we saw something that we could have mistaken for a human if it weren't for its arms that were touching the ground. The thing was at least standing 9 feet tall. When it was clear it had our attention, it moved back over the summit so that we could not see it. At this point, we had all drawn our weapons and started moving down the trail at a much faster pace. Once we were at the bottom and were back in the woods, I noticed that everything was silent except us crunching through the snow. We could see the small town now, but upon further inspection, all the houses weren't that I would call a house, more like shacks, some not even completely built, just half of a shack, and there was nobody in sight. We made our way into this town and noticed a recently put out fire pit and lots of blood and meat in some of the shacks. We called this in as well, and we were told to stay put until the other squad arrived, which wouldn't be until the next morning. So we made a fire in the fire pit that was there, and were all around the fire talking about pointless things, like another squad mate going to see his wife when back in home territory, when out of nowhere, the same howl came from just outside the light of the fire, so loud that I swear it could have shaken the rocks. Immediately, we were all up and had our weapons ready, hot-clicking on our beams, scanning the surrounding area, and seeing nothing when a huge rock hit the ground next to me. We take cover in a shack that was close, and another rock hit one of the walls and goes straight through. We were finally given the command to engage on sight and press where we think the rock came from. 3 of us flanked from around another shack and found nothing. Then we saw it. Or saw them, I should say. At least a dozen of the same thing we saw on the cliff, covered in white fur and long arms almost dragging the ground. They were huge. They were just standing there looking at us with black eyes like nothing I had ever seen. One of them making another howl and then turning and going back into the woods. The rest followed. The rest followed. And I wondered why we didn't fire. I looked over at my squad mates, and they all had wide eyes just as me. We got command to pursue, and, hesitantly, we did. We walked into the dark forest, following the tracks we could see. When we heard another howl to our right, it was followed by the sound of someone yelling. As we all turned toward the noise, we noticed that one of us was missing. We immediately gave chase to where we thought he was taken. When we came to a blood trail, we followed suit as fast as we could. We caught a glimpse of something in front of us. As we got closer, we saw another one of those things with our squad mate in its hand. I quickly shot at least half of my magazine into it, and they both dropped with a thud. I rushed over to my squad mate and realized that he was almost decapitated. I became overwhelmed with a mixture of fear and anger. We grabbed our fallen comrade and returned to the town, setting up a perimeter. Needless to say, none of us got any sleep that night. After we returned to base camp the next day, we were given orders to never speak of it. My squad mate was written off as killed in action in Afghanistan. We were told these things are called Duke's Law. In English, this means spirit of evil. I'll never forget what happened, and I don't think any of the others will. We didn't find the dead thing's body, and honestly, I didn't care. I think I could say the same for the rest of us. We just wanted to get home and be safe. Okay, so first off, I need to give some background on myself. I am a 26-year-old male living in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. My home is so rural that we have only had DSL for a few years now. My home is on a mountain and surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The mountain itself is covered in old logging trails, and quad paths make it easy to hike all over the mountain. In my years living out here, I have been out after dark a few times, but honestly, it never gets any less creepy. But what happened this night? The night I'm about to describe to you. I'm never going to go out after dark if I can help it. My family has a pair of horses, brothers who have been together their whole lives. Anytime one is gone without the other, you will immediately know, because the brother left behind will start whining and nickering. Just after dusk had fallen, I hear one of the horses having a fit. I didn't really need to go see since I knew one of them had gotten out. So I grabbed a strong flashlight, my 12 gauge, and my good boots before heading out. Sure enough, the remaining horse was standing at the gate, nickering toward the woods. I quickly started towards the path, leading off to an old logging trail that goes all around the woods. During the day, I hike all over this mountain to get exercise as well as it gives you time to think and relax. As soon as you step out after dark, nothing is the same. The sound of birds are gone, the warmth of the sun gone, and all that is left is the creaking of trees, the rustling of bushes, and the sounds of branches dropping off. Anyone who has gone hunting at night or just hiking in the dark will tell you that you tend to notice every little sound, every twig break, and every leaf rustle. All this adds up to drive your imagination wild, with thoughts of horrors lurking just out of sight. Just behind the horse pen is a small path that leads to a large logging road. The path comes out right on a hairpin turn, giving you two paths. Right-hand path is uphill, and the left-hand path goes downhill. Last time the horse got out, he was found halfway up the right path, so that's where I started searching. As I walked, I made a habit to move the light to illuminate the forest, looking for the shine of animal eyes. This is one of the easiest methods for finding animals, since the horse could easily walk off the path to find food. But I found nothing. After half an hour of searching, I stopped dead. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The feeling of being watched washed over me, and I start shining my light everywhere, looking for any glint of light off of eyes, and I listen for any sound of movement. All I hear is a soft breeze rustling the trees, and a few branches falling in the distance. It's not unusual for a bear or even a cougar to cause this kind of feeling, so I start to head back. As I walk, I keep my light shining into the woods, hoping to see the horse so I can get him back home where he will be safe. Cougars have been known to attack horses and even people when they're hungry enough, so I was starting to get worried. That feeling of being watched never left me, yet I heard nothing that would tell me I was being followed. When I made it back to the hairpin turn, I started heading down the left path. As soon as I started down it, I'm stricken with an ungodly level of fear. I shone my light everywhere, over all the brush and trees, but I couldn't see anything. I knew I had to check the path for the horse, so I keep telling myself to stop acting like a child and go look. Just for added effect, I racked my shotgun and told myself that round of 00 buck was more than enough to handle anything I found. Finally, I convinced myself to move, and I started down the path. Despite my feeling of dread growing, I kept going, and I soon noticed something shining on the path. To try and distract myself, I focused on the odd green shine. I headed towards it, trying to think of what it could be, when I hear something that stops me dead in my tracks. There was a knocking sound, like a knuckle rapping against a door. I heard 3 distinct knocks just ahead of myself, and as soon as I shone my light towards it, I hear a second set of knocks a little ways behind me. The second set could clearly be heard coming from the upper path, And it too was 3 knocks that mirrored the first set. The first thought that ran through my head was that it was a signal for a trap or an ambush. I kept shotting the light back and forth between the 2 spots I heard it, but I still saw nothing. Slowly, I started backing up the path, all the while my shotgun was swiveling back and forth. I did not want to turn my back on either spot for too long. I ended up walking about half the path backwards in an attempt not to get surprised. It wasn't until I was back at the path to my home that I saw something finally. 2 sets of eyes going from under the brush. And as soon as I saw it, I aimed at them slowly, but both sets of eyes slowly vanished. They didn't move away, and they didn't blink. They just vanished suddenly without any sound of movement. That was the final straw. I decided to never go walking in the forest at night, and I hightailed it back. As I came back, I saw something that made me go from terrified to absolutely furious in a second. The horse had returned and was staring at me as if to say, "About time you got back, now let me in." I put the horse away and went to bed, vowing to strengthen the fence to keep him from ever getting out again. The next morning, I mentioned what happened to my father, as he's been in the woods at night for many different occasions. After I finished my tale, he asked very specifically if I only heard the knocking, and when I answer yes, he gives me an odd look, but just nods. I asked him if he has had any such experience, and he simply tells me, "Oh, of course, but not knocking. I have heard loud breathing, rustling bushes with nothing there, and of course something running away very quickly." I've since fixed that fence and went back to where I heard the knocking during the day, but I found nothing of interest. The odd green thing I saw shining was a deflated balloon, which in itself is a strange find. If I ever have to go out after dark, I'm definitely going to bring someone with me. This happened, I think, back in 1999. My friends and I partied all the time, and one of our favorite places to get drunk was at this small lake down some back road in the boondocks. This was in Oklahoma, by the way. It was a weekend in the summer. We all had time away from college, so we decided to take one of the guys' RVs and go camping. The RV itself was so nice, really spacey. I think his parents had bought it. They were pretty loaded. Anyway, the 5 of us drove out to the camping site, which was weirdly empty. I thought we'd see the place packed. It was a decent temperature that year, after all. The night we got there, we started a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and had some beers. The guys played a drinking game, where they'd throw rocks at the trees one by one, and if they missed, they had to chug a whole beer. Yeah, we were easily amused. Anyway, eventually the guys were sleeping or passed out in the RV after getting too drunk, and me and Amy, the other girl, just stayed up talking into the latest hours of the night. I just couldn't get tired, and this was the first time the 2 of us had really hung out one-on-one. At one point, she shushed me. She pointed directly behind me, asking, "Did you hear that? Look over there." I thought she was joking or tricking me. I turned around to look where she was pointing, and sure enough, there was a silhouette that looked like a person's upper body, leaning over from behind a tree, looking at us. "Holy shit," I said, smiling. "That scared the hell out of me." "Same here. I thought someone was standing there," she laughed. We both stared at it. It didn't move, whatever it was. It was so inhumanly still that we both knew it had to be an oddly shaped part of the tree. It was probably just one of the guys playing a trick on us. "Sarah, get back here," Amy whispered at me. "No, I want to check this out," I whispered back. I stepped closer to the disfigured tree, but no matter how close I got to the thing, it didn't move. "That's so weird," I muttered under my breath, just before I turned to walk back. the fucking thing shifted. It pulled away from the tree and bounded off, jumping into the lake after running about 30 yards in the opposite direction. It scared the hell out of me. I couldn't make out any details. It was too dark. I turned toward Amy to ask if she had seen that, but the sight of her with her hand over her mouth told me everything. We both ran into the RV and locked the door. All three guys were inside, passed out. The next day, the four of us, except for Amy, who wasn't feeling too well, walked down to a bed of shell next to the lake to fish. It was right on the other side of the lake, and at this part we could see the RV from the edge of the water. We all cast out our poles and hoped we'd catch something. A couple of hours passed and a few of us got a nibble, but there was nothing big enough to keep. I had given up and sprawled out on a blanket to get some sun when Craig started yelling about something. I pulled the sunglasses from my face and sat up. He was pointing over toward the RV. Now, this was in the middle of the day, and the trees next to the RV were too sparse and thin to cover up much. So, I could see, and in vivid detail, what he was going crazy about. This thing had scales covering it. They shimmered every time the light hit them. It was a green-blue, almost like the color of clean, fresh water. It was at least 4 feet tall, standing on 4 legs. The way it walked made it look extremely heavy. Probably 600 or 700 pounds, I'd have to say. We were pretty far away, and this thing still looked big. It walked over to the RV and sniffed at the door. Then, it took its front claws and raked them across the door. You could hear the metallic scratch from where we were. It was trying to get inside the RV. Amy was inside there. I didn't know whether it'd be faster to run around the lake or swim right through, but one of us had to get back over there and scare the thing away. Before I took off, the creature had somehow gotten the door open. It climbed inside the RV. I covered my mouth with my hands and waited to see what would happen. All was still for a moment. Then I could see the window to the bedroom area open up at the end. Amy crawled out and landed on the ground screaming. She backed away from the RV, still staring at the window she had crawled through. That thing then ran out of the door and ran around the RV toward Amy. The moment it rounded the corner, she jumped back and screamed again. Then it ran at an insane speed into the lake. Holy fuck, I heard one of the guys breathe. They all three looked exasperated and pale. That wasn't the end of it. The moment we saw a silhouette in the water coming toward us, we all took off, abandoning the poles and tackle we had brought with us. We turned back a few times as we ran, but we never saw anything come out of the water. Amy was the most shaken by this experience. She told me afterward what happened when the thing walked in on her. She said she had fallen asleep, and when she opened her eyes, this scaly thing was standing over her. She damn near jumped out of the window. She says sometimes it keeps her up at night, wondering what would have happened had she never woke up. Beware the waters of this planet. They are as vast as they are deep. Man may never know the true magnitude of the oceans and lakes of the world. Forgive my artsy introduction. I had to say it. The following experience has really confirmed for me how small I am, how small we are compared to the world, and just how uncharted the entirety of the earth really is. You'd think that by now in 2016, we'd have been able to capture pictures of everything and anything that had escaped us before, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. Surely, if one of these things existed, we'd have photographic proof, right? This is what I once thought, but I now know how freaking wrong I was. That was a terrible, shallow way for me to think. Now, on to my experience. I was a freshwater diver. It was a hobby. I wish I could have been doing it for a living, but what you gonna do? Every weekend, if I had the time, I would head out with a friend with my boat and dive for a couple of hours. We would go out to whichever deep ponds or lakes we could find, and we'd take turns using the expensive as hell diving suit we had mostly bought. A lot of it we actually had to fix or make up with our own fixtures. All in all, the suit worked perfectly. The tank held well. The airline didn't leak. It was everything we needed. This particular day, I had actually remembered to bring my camera. We had a lot of stuff to pack when we did this, so it was far too easy to forget that damned waterproof camera we had. We found an especially large pond. It was pretty much a lake. It was really muddy, but that didn't keep me away. Anyway, once we had the boat unloaded and we hopped inside, we drove toward a shallow area on the opposite side that seemed clearer than the rest. It seemed promising enough. I was first up. I pulled up my mask and goggles and dropped in. The water was as murky as I thought it would be. I'd say I was only able to see about 5 yards in front of me. There were no fish at the top, but I was sure to see something as I swam further down. Everything was a tint of brown. The further down I went, the less light broke through the muddy water. I followed the bank, gripping onto roots and rocks that jutted out to pull myself down. It was way easier than just kicking and pushing myself lower. I made my way slowly to deeper water. I kept my eyes open, looking for any interesting formations or curious fish. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, though. I could feel the pressure on my body. I think I was about 10 yards down, but I pushed down further. I wanted to see everything I possibly could. Hell, if I could hit the bottom, that would be amazing. It was starting to get pretty dark. In my left hand, I had my waterproof torch, so I clicked that on and looked around. My stomach turned when I saw it. Black, scaly skin. It almost looked like a shimmering wall, but it must have been from a fish of some sort. It was right in front of my face. The thing was huge. So big, in fact, that despite the light, I could not see the head or the tail of it. I wasn't sure if I was staring at its midsection, but it was thick and tall. When I looked closer, I could see that the thing was moving. I wanted to swim upward back to the boat, but I was starting to feel more excited than anything. Eventually, its visible body began to thin, as if the tail was about to come up. I readied the camera for the tail of whatever this thing was. Finally, it came, then stopped directly in front of me. This wasn't the tail. The creature must have been backing up, because I was locking eyes with this thing. Its head was narrow and long, with the mouth opening and closing, revealing hundreds of teeth about the size of my fingers. I believe it was staring at me, those big black orbs with cloudy gray fixtures in the middle of them. It looked exactly like an eel, but this was the biggest living thing I had personally ever seen. Slowly, being sure to not make any sudden movements, I pulled up my camera and took a picture. I tried to shine the torch on it, but I would just have to wait and see what would show up on the photo. I looked closely at it, and it seemed it was floating ever closer to me. I had to get out of that water immediately, but if I kicked too hard or swam too fast, this thing would think of me as food and nothing else. Keeping myself from floating up, I held onto the rocks and roots again. I ascended as slowly as possible, my back now facing the eel-like thing. Every inch closer to the surface was a relief. It seemed to take an eternity, but eventually I was only a few feet from the top. Summoning my courage, I looked over my shoulder to peer down where I was. I wanted to see if the thing was still there. This creature was right behind me still, but closer, its snout almost touching my shoulder. Seeing that, I freaked out and almost jumped out of the water. I clambered into the boat, all the while my friend yelling, wondering why the hell I was so panicky. I told him to get back to shore as fast as he could, and I would tell him. And I did. I asked how he didn't see something so huge and dark just below the water. He said he was texting someone. Figures. Even worse though, when I had the picture developed, it was all black. I guess it was too dark for the camera to pick up on anything. But ever since that day, I've been way more cautious when I've stepped foot in the water. The sheer size of that creature has made me realize a few things. No matter how sure we are that we know everything, there will always be mysteries out there. Also, if that thing had been more hungry than curious that day, I believe I wouldn't be around to share this story with you. During the summer of 2013, I was living in Arkansas near Mount Magazine with my roommate, Austin. We were avid hikers, and Arkansas is one of the best places for hiking, camping, and the like. So you better believe we were out there every weekend, enduring the terrain and enjoying the natural beauty of the place. Then, all in one night, my passion for the outdoors ceased to exist. Austin and I had been planning a weekend to hike around the woods near the base of Mount Magazine, but we had both been pretty busy. Then, by chance, our weekends opened up and we were able to set out. We headed out on a Saturday morning and would leave on Monday morning. We didn't work on Mondays. It was all set. Our gear had been pre-packed a week in advance. I drove my truck out to a small dirt road where we parked it a bit off the path and locked it up. A park ranger wouldn't be very happy about someone just leaving their truck on the side of the road and camping off the trails and paths. But this is what we did. It seemed more natural and exciting that way. Plus, we were away from other campers. That alone made it well worth the trouble. Throwing on our packs and grabbing our gear, we headed into the woods. After walking about an hour and a half in, we settled down and put up tents. It was a bit early to be setting up camp, but a nearby pond had Austin's blood pumping. So, of course, we grabbed our poles and found a couple of good spots by the water. It was a very misty day. The sky was quite gray. There was fog rolling over the large pond, almost a lake. The scenery was absolutely beautiful. But all of that serenity was broken suddenly by a crash. It sounded like it came from the other side of the pond. Both our heads jerked up. Yet, there was nothing there. Austin went back to fishing and whistling a tune I didn't recognize. But I felt awed, to say the least. It was as if I could feel eyes on me, under someone's watch. I couldn't concentrate on fishing like he could. I know it was probably a fish that had jumped out of the water or a rock slipping and falling in. Maybe I was just paranoid. Horror fans usually are. Well, the moment we heard that disturbing hissing sound behind us, I knew my fears weren't unsubstantiated. All at once, we jumped, dropping our fishing poles and turning toward the noise. Before us was what appeared to be a very pale, hairless creature on all fours. Though its limbs were similar to a person's, it was the shape of those limbs that confirmed that it was not human. Its arms were impossibly thin and bent at a wrong angle, not to mention they had to be a bit longer than its legs. The nails were disgusting and dirty, sunk into the earth below it. The thing spat its inhuman hiss at us once more, before it vanished into the woods behind it. From the time we saw it to the moment it disappeared into those trees, it could only have been a few seconds. The speed at which this thing moved on all fours was staggering. It was faster than I've ever seen any person run, almost like a large dog at full speed. We stood there, staring down the edge of those woods for about 10 minutes, not uttering a word. Eventually, we grabbed our stuff. Obviously, both of us were shaking as we could barely pick up our poles. The walk back to camp was chilling. We walked almost back to back, trying to see in every direction at once. I personally have never been more afraid in my life. Back at the campsite, I began packing up my stuff when Austin grabbed me by the shoulder and spoke. What are you doing? What do you mean? I asked, surprised at his confusion. I'm leaving. We're leaving. We've been planning this, man. Come on. We should at least stay the night. I glared at him. Are you kidding me right now, man? Did you not see that thing? I don't care if it's 3 states away by now. I don't want to be here. Dude, don't be a wuss. I could have slapped him right then. We had just seen something out of a freaking nightmare, and he wanted to spend the night. We can share a tent, he compromised. Fine. I laid my stuff back down. We started a fire and tried to take our mind off of things with a bit of badly played guitar music and some PSPs we had brought. Yeah, we loved camping, but we also loved Monster Hunter. Besides, I needed to take my mind off of anything forest related, and gaming was perfect for that. The night settled down. The fire crackled. Austin began nodding off. I could see him trying to keep himself awake. He must have still been a little bit spooked. We had already gotten inside our sleeping bags in one of our tents. I tried to stay awake, my ears picking up any and every noise outside as I watched the fire cast shadows on the tent walls. Yeah, I know, we shouldn't have kept the fire going, but now more than ever, I think we both needed a little light. I did unzip the bottom of the tent though, enough to see the fire's base to make sure it didn't go out of control. I did not expect to get any sleep that night. But somehow, I did. I woke up in the middle of the night. God knows how late it must have been. The moment I realized that I had slept, my eyes widened, and I sat up in my sleeping bag. Almost immediately, I regretted making so much damned noise. Because there was a shadow cast upon our tent by the fading fire. A shadow that wasn't ours, with heaving shoulders and a grotesque body. Someone outside was crying. I lay back down as quietly as possible. But nylon has got to be the noisiest material on the planet. Whoever was out there had to have heard me, but they didn't turn or leave. They just kept crying, or what sounded like crying. As soon as my head hit the thin pillow, my eyes not breaking contact with the shadow, the open portion of the flap revealed everything to me. This was no person. It had very familiar, veiny, pale skin and impossibly thin legs. That thing sat there, sobbing next to the fire for 2 or so hours. There's no exaggeration there. I stared at it for so long, trying not to breathe and failing miserably. Minutes before sunrise, the sobbing stopped, and I watched as its shadow hunched down on all 4s and crawled away. Austin snored about an hour past sunlight, then finally woke up fully refreshed. I never went back to sleep. I didn't even move until Austin stood up from his sleeping bag and walked outside to pee. Without a word, I got dressed and again started packing everything. I did not tell Austin what had happened that night, and he didn't stop me from getting our things together this time. It wasn't until the quiet drive home that Austin finally said something. "Are you all right, man?" he asked me. "Yeah, could be better though," I replied. "I heard you last night," he sighed. "What do you mean?" I felt confused. "Well, I heard you crying last night."
Cabins are so creepy. I guess it's my fault, though, for letting myself get creeped out by something that's supposed to be a vacation getaway. But I can't help but think about all the dozens of stories I've read online about creepy experiences at cabins. I can say for sure that I never thought I'd experience something for myself. My friend Laura and I decided to go up to my grandma's cabin one weekend during the winter. The cabin was deep in the woods of North Dakota. It was a beautiful place. I often stayed there with my grandparents as a child. Now, I was in college, and it was time to relax after some pain-in-the-ass finals. The first night was exactly what I hoped it would be. We played video games, talked, and laughed. I spent the morning drinking coffee and reading a book on the couch. I wish I could spend every day like that. Well, it wasn't until night that things get a little weird. "Hey, Melissa." Laura called to me as she walked inside. She had just gone to the gas station in my Jeep to get some cigarettes. "What's up?" I asked. When I walked around the corner, I noticed she had entered through the front door backwards, keeping her eyes on something just beyond the glass of the door. "Do you see it?" she murmured. I almost didn't hear her. I leaned over and looked out of the living room window. All I saw was the snow-covered road that emerged from the woods and led up to the driveway. I don't see what... Before I could finish, a tall, dark silhouette stepped from the tree line by the road on the right and onto the road itself. It had a long stride. In 2 steps it had crossed nearly onto the other side of the road. It just stopped there. We could see it turning in every direction. "Who the hell is that?" You could hear the confusion in Laura's voice. "I have no idea. There's no cabins anywhere close to here. That gas station is the closest thing to us, and it's a 20-minute drive out." My mind was reeling. Who's the guy just standing there out in the driveway? The figure then turned back toward the tree line from which it had originated and took 2 long steps. It disappeared quickly into the woods. I threw on my jacket and boots. Without a word, Laura did the same. We have always been a curious pair. Fear always came second to our curiosity. Maybe that's why I can read hours of scary stories. Anyway, we stepped out onto the driveway and headed toward the beginning of the road that entered the woods. The snow itself was at least 8 inches deep. As soon as we stood where that man was, we saw the tracks on the ground. Hooves. There were obvious hoof prints on the ground like a ram or sheep had been walking around. We did not see anyone or anything but that man a few seconds ago. Unless he was walking a goat or something that was bleach white like the snow, there were no animals out there. We looked at each other and quickly walked back inside. Together, we sat on the couch and warmed ourselves with the fireplace. The TV played MTV something or other, but we both couldn't help but feel a little odd. Eventually, it escaped my mind, and I was able to fall asleep pretty easy. But loud stomping in the middle of the night forced me back to life. Thud, thud, thud. I couldn't make out where it was coming from, but it ganked me from my sleep. Droopy-eyed, I peeked out at the windows of my room. It snowed lightly outside, but I didn't see anyone out there. It must have been Laura stopping down the hallway to get a glass of water. She had never been very light-footed. Thud, thud, thud. The sound came again, and I knew immediately that the sound was not coming from within the house. Now wide-eyed, I got up with my blanket and headed toward the living room. It must have been a full moon that night, because the window shone with quite a bit of light, enough that I could make out the details of the tree line through the windows. I stepped quietly into the living room. Laura was already there, kneeling behind the recliner with her face peeking over it. Before I could ask what the hell she was doing, a tall silhouette appeared behind the curtains of the window. Thud, thud, thud. Someone was on our porch. They walked back and forth from the door to the window over and over again. It looked like he was trying to peek through, trying to find a gap in the curtains. Instinctively, I darted over to the recliner and ducked next to Laura. "He's been there for the last hour," she whispered to me, even though I doubt he could hear us. Mouth open, I watched in horror as this figure walked around our porch, stomping far too loudly than I thought possible. I figured the boots or shoes of anyone would have crunched with all that snow. We didn't have an awning out there. Then he stomped back over to the door and started pounding with his fist. And I'm not talking violently knocking. He was trying to break down the freaking door. I couldn't keep myself from shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. That's when we heard the loudest, weirdest sounding scream. There's no way that was human. The scream literally lasted for the duration of a minute. 60 seconds at least of some otherworldly screech. As quickly as it started, it stopped. No stomping, no screaming. All but the howling of the wind had become silent. We didn't go back to our rooms, and we didn't go to sleep. We sat there together, hunched in the floor all night. As soon as daylight broke through those thankfully thick curtains, we packed up and left. I have no idea what we saw out there, but there were hundreds of footprints on our porch. There wasn't a single human footprint in the snow outside, save for our own. Whether that thing was human or not, I want to know one thing. Where the hell did those hoofprints come from? When I lived in southeast Pennsylvania, I would often go on walks with my dog, Randy, through wooded trails near my home at night. I've always enjoyed the nighttime. It seems more peaceful, not to mention I loved painting and sketching. Every time I went on one of those walks, I'd come back refreshed and inspired. I did my best painting on these late nights. The trails we walked on used to be bustling four-wheeler trails that the neighbors used almost constantly. They had been avid hunters, fishers, those sort of folks. They were also extremely nice and didn't mind me using the trails as often as I wanted to. Sadly, though, the couple that owned the property had died a few months before this story took place. The man had died of a heart attack, and his wife passed away maybe 6 weeks after from what my mother said was old age. It was depressing, really. They were some of the nicest people I have ever met. At the start of the trail, you could see their 2-story home on top of a hill, overlooking the nearby lake. It was gorgeous. I wished I could live there. Now the place was dark, and it seemed hollow. That night, I stood staring at their house for a moment, thinking about life a little more than I was used to, before I took an impatient Randy into the woods. He was really excited. He usually was when he went on walks, but tonight he seemed more anxious. For the first time since he was a puppy, Randy was tugging at my leash as I tried to keep up. He was never that pushy. He seemed to have found the scent of something curious. Randy kept his nose to the ground and kept zero slack on the leash. It was hardly peaceful with the dog dragging me around. But I didn't want to reprimand him. I mean, he had never acted up like that before, so I let him keep going. Who knows, maybe he'd stumble on something interesting. Or gross, we all know how dogs are. I started to worry, though. The moment he stopped, he began to whimper. His ears fell flat as he looked straight ahead, eyes wide. I could see him sniff the air in between whimpers. To be honest, it kind of freaked me out. All of this was beyond unusual for him, and it was dark, in the middle of the woods. The creepy factor of it all was palpable. It was tempting to head back. Before I could even decide whether or not to keep going, Randy snapped backward and ran back on the trail so quickly that I lost my grip on the leash. He ran full speed toward home. And after a few moments, I was alone in the woods. The realization of that fact hit hard. It seemed to fall silent. The nocturnal insects chirped at a whisper now. Too spooked to run, if that makes any sense. I turned back to walk home. I was honestly a little pissed at Randy for being such a wuss and abandoning me, but I was just so ready to be home. I needed some sleep anyway. I walked the slightly uphill trail as fast as I could, without going too fast that it made me feel like I was running from something. Then, I heard it. It was a screech, a howl, and a scream at the same time. Have you ever heard something so sudden and out of this world that it not only made you jump, but it sent chills throughout your whole body? Imagine that twice over, and that is how I felt the moment I heard it. I couldn't understand how something could sound so human and inhuman at the same time. What worried me even more was the fact that I couldn't place where it came from. I started to jog now, I have no earthly idea why I didn't just run. When I heard the call again, my heart seemed to jump into my throat. It was cold that night, but I was sweating. Finally, I pushed myself to run. That noise was so far beyond human, I was sure I'd be dead if I didn't run with everything I had. After a painful minute of running, I broke through the trail's opening, and it was out of the woods. I didn't bother to turn around. I was just glad that I was away from whatever I had heard. But the screaming came again. The sound had been coming from ahead of me, not behind me. I had run toward the noise. How could I not have known it was coming from ahead of me? I clambered backward, terrified. I couldn't go back into those woods, but I couldn't go forward toward those noises. Clomp, 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 clomp. I heard footsteps. They were coming from directly ahead of me, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. But I couldn't see anything. There were trees shrouded in complete darkness, peppered sporadically throughout the clearing. It must have been hidden by the shadows. For several agonizing moments, there was silence. No screaming, no footsteps. Maybe it was my imagination. I was praying that that's what it was. To my horror, a face poked out of the darkness. It was just a goat. I almost laughed with relief. I was confused, but at least I wasn't horrified anymore. I remember thinking where the hell the goat had come from. We didn't own one, and neither had the neighbors. I picked myself up, eager to get home. I walked forward and to the left, where the trail went to the backyard of my home. I looked back. To this day, I regret looking back. What I thought was a goat was hovering at least 15 feet in the air. Wings somehow darker than the night flapped behind it. I had enough. I turned and broke into the fastest run I could muster. In seconds, I was opening the back door and locking the deadbolt. I stared out of the window. The center 80% of the door was made of glass, but I didn't see anything. I kept staring for the longest time, wondering what the hell I had just seen. There was nothing. Thank God there was nothing. Eventually, I turned around toward the living room. My dog, Randy, was just sitting there on the couch, looking up at me like he had been waiting for me for a while. My parents must have let him in. I don't know what it was I saw that night. I've told quite a few people about my experience, but no one believes me. I doubt anyone ever will. And to be completely truthful with you, this isn't so much a story as it is a confession. I want an explanation. And every time I tell this tale, it makes me feel a little bit better. So thank you for listening. Here is some background. I live in Arizona, and my aunt is Navajo. So one night, I was with my grandma in northern Arizona when she herself and my aunt, who is also Navajo, saw what she called the Dog Man, but my aunt called it a skinwalker. She said, as they drove through the woods just before the city of Show Low, Arizona, they spotted on the road what seemed to be a large mass of fur. A dead animal, my grandma thought. It may have been a dead elk because of its massive size, she thought, until it stood up on its hind legs. She said as it must have been 7, maybe even 8 feet tall. She said it had the body of a muscular man, and its hands had long, dagger-like nails. But its head, she told me, its head was not human. My aunt said it had the head of a coyote. Its eyes glowed bright yellow. My grandma slammed on her brakes, and it just looked at her. And with one step, it was off the road and gone in the darkness of the pine trees. She said it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen, and she'll never forget it.
When I lived in southeast Pennsylvania, I would often go on walks with my dog, Randy, through wooded trails near my home at night. I've always enjoyed the nighttime. It seems more peaceful, not to mention I loved painting and sketching. Every time I went on one of those walks, I'd come back refreshed and inspired. I did my best painting on these late nights. The trails we walked on used to be bustling four-wheeler trails that the neighbors used almost constantly. They had been avid hunters, fishers, those sort of folks. They were also extremely nice and didn't mind me using the trails as often as I wanted to. Sadly, though, the couple that owned the property had died a few months before this story took place. The man had died of a heart attack, and his wife passed away maybe 6 weeks after from what my mother said was old age. It was depressing, really. They were some of the nicest people I have ever met. At the start of the trail, you could see their two-story home on top of a hill, overlooking the nearby lake. It was gorgeous. I wished I could live there. Now the place was dark, and it seemed hollow. That night, I stood staring at their house for a moment, thinking about life a little more than I was used to, before I took an impatient Randy into the woods. He was really excited. He usually was when he went on walks, but tonight he seemed more anxious. For the first time since he was a puppy, Randy was tugging at my leash as I tried to keep up. He was never that pushy. He seemed to have found the scent of something curious. Randy kept his nose to the ground and kept a zero slack on the leash. It was hardly peaceful with the dog dragging me around. But I didn't want to reprimand him. He had never acted up like that before, so I let him keep going. Who knows, maybe he'd stumble on something interesting. Or gross. We all know how dogs are. I started to worry, though. The moment he stopped, he began to whimper. His ears fell flat as he looked straight ahead, eyes wide. I could see him sniff the air in between whimpers. To be honest, it kind of freaked me out. All of this was beyond unusual for him, and it was dark, in the middle of the woods. The creepy factor of it all was palpable. It was tempting to head back. Before I could even decide whether or not to keep going, Randy snapped backward and ran back on the trail so quickly that I lost my grip on the leash. He ran full speed toward home. And after a few moments, I was alone in the woods. The realization of that fact hit hard. It seemed to fall silent. The nocturnal insects chirped at a whisper now. Too spooked to run, if that makes any sense. I turned back to walk home. I was honestly a little pissed at Randy for being such a wuss and abandoning me, but I was just so ready to be home. I needed some sleep anyway. I walked the slightly uphill trail as fast as I could, without going too fast that it made me feel like I was running from something. Then, I heard it. It was a screech, a howl, and a scream at the same time. Have you ever heard something so sudden and out of this world that it not only made you jump, but it sent chills throughout your whole body? Imagine that twice over, and that is how I felt the moment I heard it. I couldn't understand how something could sound so human and inhuman at the same time. What worried me even more was the fact that I couldn't place where it came from. I started to jog now. I have no earthly idea why I didn't just run. When I heard the call again, my heart seemed to jump into my throat. It was cold that night, but I was sweating. Finally, I pushed myself to run. That noise was so far beyond human. I was sure I'd be dead if I didn't run with everything I had. After a painful minute of running, I broke through the trail's opening and was out of the woods. I didn't bother to turn around. I was just glad that I was away from whatever I had heard. But the screaming came again. The sound had been coming from ahead of me, not behind me. I had run toward the noise. How could I not have known it was coming from ahead of me? I clambered backward, terrified. I couldn't go back into those woods, but I couldn't go forward toward those noises. Clop, 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 clop. I heard footsteps. They were coming from directly ahead of me, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. But I couldn't see anything. There were trees shrouded in complete darkness, peppered sporadically throughout the clearing. It must have been hidden by the shadows. For several agonizing moments, there was silence. No screaming, no footsteps. Maybe it was my imagination. I was praying that that's what it was. To my horror, a face poked out of the darkness. It was just a goat. I almost laughed with relief. I was confused, but at least I wasn't horrified anymore. I remember thinking where the hell the goat had come from. We didn't own one, and neither had the neighbors. I picked myself up, eager to get home. I walked forward and to the left, where the trail went to the backyard of my home. I looked back. To this day, I regret looking back. What I thought was a goat was hovering at least 15 feet in the air. Wings somehow darker than the night flapped behind it. I had enough. I turned and broke into the fastest run I could muster. In seconds, I was opening the back door and locking the deadbolt. I stared out at the window. The center 80% of the door was made of glass, but I didn't see anything. I kept staring for the longest time, wondering what the hell I had just seen. There was nothing. Thank God there was nothing. Eventually, I turned around toward the living room. My dog, Randy, was just sitting there on the couch, looking up at me like he had been waiting for me for a while. My parents must have let him in. I don't know what it was I saw that night. I've told quite a few people about my experience, but no one believes me. I doubt anyone ever will. And to be completely truthful with you, this isn't so much a story as it is a confession. I want an explanation. And every time I tell this tale, it makes me feel a little bit better. So thank you for listening. Here is some background. I live in Arizona, and my aunt is Navajo. So one night, I was with my grandma in northern Arizona when she herself and my aunt, who is also Navajo, saw what she called the dog man, but my aunt called it a skinwalker. She said, as they drove through the woods just before the city of Show Low, Arizona, they spotted on the road what seemed to be a large mass of fur. A dead animal, my grandma thought. It may have been a dead elk, because of its massive size, she thought, until it stood up on its hind legs. She said as it must have been 7, maybe even 8 feet tall. She said it had the body of a muscular man, and its hands had long, dagger-like nails. But its head, she told me, its head was not human. My aunt said it had the head of a coyote. Its eyes glowed bright yellow. My grandma slammed on her brakes, and it just looked at her. And with one step, it was off the road and gone in the darkness of the pine trees. She said it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen, and she'll never forget it. In August of 2013, I was in the Bel Air Forest in Manitoba, Canada, doing some trail riding on my dirt bike about 3 kilometers deep into the woods. I've been riding these same trails for my entire life, as well as hunted the surrounding woods for years, as has my father and his before him. Riding these trails for as long as I have, I've had my share of close calls with black bears and wolves, and at one time, a pissed-off buck. So, for protection, I carried my father's .357 Magnum revolver. While I understand the pistol laws in Canada, I I consider my actions justified, as I'm sure you will agree that if I hadn't had the gun, I doubt I would be typing this now. As I was riding through the trails for a good 2 hours, I was getting tired. So, I decided to take a rest at the top of a sand pit to see if I could catch a deer walking around, or some coyotes looking for a meal. But as I shut off my bike and dropped my pack, I instantly noticed the absolute silence. While I was alone and in the woods, I wasn't too far in, so hearing the highway or some signs of civilization is normal. But there was nothing, not even a single bird singing or a gust of wind in the trees. I have never had a feeling of such isolation in my life. I was a little uneasy at first by the creepy silence, but I got over it pretty quick and proceeded to get some water out of my pack and laid down in the shade of a large rock overseeing the sand pits and forest's edge. After about 10 minutes of just chilling there, waiting for whatever may come across my line of sight, I saw some movement just past the tree line bordering the pits. I reached for my pack to pull out my binoculars to try to get a glimpse of what it was. But as I looked at the area, before I could get the binoculars to focus on the spot, 3 deer, 2 does and a buck, emerged from the bush running for their lives. It seemed for what I assumed to be a pack of wolves. I sat there, looking through the binoculars, trying to see if I could catch a glimpse of what had spooked them. But I saw nothing, and I decided to go check it out. Keep in mind, I'm on a 250cc 4-stroke race bike, so it's loud enough to scare off any animal. But being cautious, I pulled the revolver from my pack and strapped it to my belt just in case. But as I got my gear back on and set on my bike about to start it, I heard an absolutely horrifying scream bellow out from the forest, only amplified by the silence before. Startled, I realized that whatever was chasing those deer must have snagged one. But the deer's screams continued. This was very odd, the sound seeming more and more distressed. I can't imagine something more distressful than being eaten alive by wolves nonetheless. But the screams just got louder and more unsettling. It didn't even sound like a deer anymore, but like a woman's screams, like she was being horribly mutilated, until the cries were muffled by a gargling, and it just stopped. Not knowing what to take of what I just heard, without even thinking, I started my bike and rode for the trail closest to the area the sound had come from. Going slowly, looking in all directions, trying to spot anything, tracks of blood, tufts of fur, anything to tell me where the deer went. But I couldn't find any traces of what direction they may have gone. After looking for a good while, I decided to give up and head back to load up and go home. But just as I got going, I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. So I pull over and turn off my bike to take the call. It's my mom, just checking on me. What time I will be home, I tell her around 45 minutes to an hour. So she says be safe, and we hang up. As I'm putting my phone back in my pocket, I hear what sounds like an animal breathing heavily, not panting, but taking long, deep breaths, in between a terrible sound of chewing and slurping. I freeze in place, trying to identify what direction the noise had come from. I slowly turn my head to the right and then to the left and see what it was. I sigh in relief to see that it's only a black bear, maybe 70 feet away in the thick brush. It feasted on the deer from before, knowing there was no way it could make it through the tree-dense forest fast enough to catch me, even if it wanted to. I sat for a second to check it out. After a while, I got bored of staying in one spot, so I decided it was time to get going. But first, I just had to see if I could get the bear's attention. I wanted him to notice me because I guess I'm a dumbass like that. I started yelling at it, calling out to the bear as loud as I could with my foot on the kickstart, ready to get the hell out of there. I yell and yell, but it does not acknowledge me. I'm a little bit annoyed that it is ignoring me. I decided to remove the revolver and fire a shot into the ground next to it because, like I said, I'm not very smart like that. And I looked over to see it staring directly at me. Satisfied that it had finally stopped to look at me, I holstered the revolver and clipped it in before looking back at the animal. This time looking to see if it had caught one of the deer from before. But as I focused my eyes on the carcass, I noticed there was next to nothing left of it. How could one bear eat an entire deer in only a few minutes? I looked back at the animal to see it had turned its whole body toward me, staring me down with big, bright yellow eyes. It was no bear. I thought to myself in the seconds I had to assess the situation, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at, and what was looking back at me. Finally, I decided that I was done. I turned back to start my bike and make my getaway. And of course, it won't start right away. Like a cliché movie, I kick over and over in panic, thinking this can't be fucking happening. I look back to see the creature walking towards me slowly, like it was taunting me, knowing I couldn't go anywhere. I'm in a full panic at this point. I fear the same fate as the deer as I look again to see this beast rise to its hind legs with a horrible cracking and crunching noise. I felt my life drained from my body as the creature stood only meters from me. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It stood at least 9 feet tall. Its face was that of a bear, but with human features like its ears and eyes, although massive in comparison to the rest of its head. It was incredibly thin and bleach white, aside from what seemed like a black pelt on its back, draped over its fragile-looking body. I couldn't move a muscle or make a noise as hard as I tried to scream. But as I stared into its eyes, it closed them, tilted its head back to let out a cry like I have never heard before. And I pray I never hear that noise again. With this cry, I snapped out of my trance-like state and reached out for my gun, shooting it 3 times in the chest. It fell to the ground, but only for a moment. Then it sprang up, looked at me with rage in its eyes, and I shot once more. I missed, and it quickly ducked behind a large pine. I rushed to start my bike again, and thank God that it starts. But as I look up, I see it lunge from behind the tree as I floor it down the trail. Eventually regaining the courage to turn around and look back, I saw that it wasn't behind me. But when I looked back to face the trail again, my front tire hit a rock and sent me flying over the bars. I ignored all the pain. I scrambled back to the bike, which was now stalled. I looked to check the revolver to see how many bullets I have left. There's just one. I think I'm fucked. I pick up the bike. The handlebars are bent to shit, and my clutch is barely hanging on. And all I hear now is that thing running full speed at me through the brush. Knowing that the bike won't start in time, I take a steady stance and wait for it to come in range as it gets closer. The reality that this could be my last moment steadied my hand, and when it broke the tree line, I fired, skimming the top of its head just by its right ear. It dropped to the ground, clutching at its head, at the new wound, with long-fingered human-like hands. It screamed in agony before running away back into the woods out of sight. I got my bike, and somehow, it started again, and I wasted no time getting back to my truck. I dropped my bike and left it there, rushing home. When I got back home, my mom was there and was surprised to see me home so soon. I had made a 45-minute drive in about 15 minutes, without even noticing. I told her the whole story, and the only reason she believed me was that I would never just abandon my bike out there. My father went to retrieve my bike with my brother the next day. I refused to go back. I begged them to leave it well enough alone. But when they brought it back to my house, the bike had been complacently destroyed. All plastics ripped off the frame and bent and broken, and large channels dug through the rubber of the tires. After seeing that they all believed my story, none of us have gone back to that trail since.
In the middle of summer of 2011, me and my friends, for privacy reasons we'll call them Harry, Tom, Carson, and Rob, we took a trip to the mountains a couple of hours away from our hometown. Once we got there, we noticed that there were less people than we expected, especially considering it was the middle of the summer. We then rented one cabin for 3 days, which had a view of the lake and was surprisingly not that expensive. Once we got settled in, me, Rob, and Tom went straight to swimming in the lake, and I swam for a while until I found myself in the middle of the lake. I had this terrible, strange feeling that I was being watched, but not from land, but from below me. Somehow I felt it was from below me. So I looked down, and of course, I saw nothing. For a moment I thought I was just getting exhausted from swimming, so I decided to head back to the dock. Yet in the back of my mind I still had that terrible feeling of being watched. When me and my friends went back to the cabin, Harry had brought firewood and sodas from the general store. Later that evening, we started a fire and talked about stuff like things going on in the neighborhood and stuff like that. After we had dinner, I still had that feeling of being watched from the lake. I took a glance and saw something hairy and small around the edge of the lake. Before I could get a good look at it, it was gone. I told the others about it, and they said it was probably an otter or something, because otters were quite common in that area. By this point, I'm just trying to ignore it and continue with my night. Sleeping that night wasn't easy. The next morning, I took a look out onto the lake from my window. No otters, no logs, no nothing. I just decided to brush it all off as me being paranoid. On the second night, I woke up to the sound of some weird howls only a couple miles away from the cabin. Whenever I tried to fall asleep again, I would hear that strange howl, but closer and closer every time. When I practically heard it right beside our cabin, I opened my eyes, and I saw a face in the window. It's hard to describe it, but it had a long, pale face and completely black eyes. It must have not seen me, because it was at the window for a while, but finally left. I could barely comprehend what had happened. I remembered that the window in Carson's room had been up, because there was no air conditioning in the cabin. Not a minute later, I heard a loud scream come from Carson's room. Me and the rest of my friends rushed to Carson's room, and his face was pale. He was breathing heavily. He told us that something had tried to put its hand through the window to get inside, but he couldn't see what it looked like. We continued to hear those howls around the cabin and banging from the front door. We decided to wait the thing out, and we finally hightailed it out of there. We were lucky that it never came into our cabin. Once the howling and banging on the front door stopped, we immediately went out to the truck and got out of there. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw through my window, and eventually we did come back, only to find large claw marks all over the doors and walls. I do have the occasional nightmare of that thing taking me from my bed. We never told what happened to our parents, and just said we decided to cut the trip short. Occasionally, I would drive by that lake, and I can only imagine what would have happened if that thing had intruded into our cabin that night. When I was 20, I used to work as a pizza delivery guy in a small city in northern Germany. On my way home, I had to drive a few miles on a remote state street that led through forest and farmland. One night, it must have been around 1 in the morning, there was a huge thunderstorm, and I had to drive slowly and carefully. When I came to a road junction, I noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road. It looked like a tall and slender man in a long black leather cloak with a hood. At first, I thought it was someone who had an accident and was looking for help, but when my headlights hit the figure, I noticed that the cloak, especially the hood of it, appeared to be empty. My headlights did not illuminate the cloak whatsoever, like they should have. It was just the lightning reflecting on the smooth, wet surface that allowed me to see the shape. Of course, I floored the gas pedal and went as fast as I dared. A couple of miles later, I ran into the same, or at least a very similar figure, again standing right in the middle of the road and not moving at all. This time I didn't even slow down and rushed right past it. It scared me to death. A couple of weeks later, this time no thunderstorm, just a beautiful warm summer night, I encountered another creature right where I saw the black figure before. It looked like a giant deer, but without fur, with pale, gray-white skin. It was extremely skinny, almost skeletal, and had an abnormally long and thin tail. It ran along the side of the road and kept pace with me quite easily as I drove past. Only when I slammed the gas pedal and went suicidally fast, it started to fall behind and eventually disappeared in a crop. The very next day, I quit that job and never used that road at night again. This happened to me a couple of years back when we first moved to Ohio. You probably know Ohio for its major cities like Cleveland and Cincinnati, but outside of town there's nothing but trees and, well, more trees. We moved from an apartment complex to an old cabin because my mom wanted to get out of town. I know it sounds stereotypical to move to a creepy cabin, but it's true. You're probably wondering then, why would we move to such a creepy place? Well, my mom wanted to be able to sit out on the front porch and sip coffee in peace. Well, I always wanted to go out and make things, discover things, and just have fun. But on the inside, I did have a fear of something out there. My sister, who is a couple of years older than me, wanted to hang out with her friends. She hated going outside and actually doing things, which is unfortunate, because I wanted someone to play with. Luckily for me, though, I had my black dog, Fluffy. She's a black lab with a touch of white on her chest, and she was really soft as a puppy, so that's how she got her name. She'd often run off, but she would always come back later. So I stopped worrying about her eventually. My dad moved with his side of the family who lived somewhere west. I honestly forgot where exactly. It's been so long. So it's just me, my mom, and my sister, alone. Now that I get that out of the way, this is my encounter with a creature that still has gone unexplained. My sister and I were camping outside of the cabin. For some reason, she is always cooking marshmallows over the stove in the house. It's a good idea, they're tasty, but it's odd. Since she likes marshmallows and I'm basically a pyromaniac, we decided to camp outside, right where our yard meets the trees, and start a fire. After we had our fair share of marshmallows and hot dogs, I slept inside my sister's car. Because we didn't have a tent, she just went inside the house to sleep. I woke up to the sound of bushes crackling and rustling. I don't know what time it was because I didn't have anything to check, but the lights in the house were out except for the porch lights, so everyone must have been asleep. I sat up from the passenger seat and tried to focus my eyes in the darkness outside. The bush that was moving was right by the passenger door, which was where I was sleeping, and after listening and looking out the window for a solid 10 minutes, I decided that I was going to try to get back to sleep. But I started to hype myself up. I rounded up the courage to hop out of the car and run for it. I made it to the back porch and turned and looked to see if I was being followed. But I still couldn't see everything very well, it was so dark. All I could see was the red-hot coals of the fire we made. Then I turned to open the door, but I heard something running towards me. It almost sounded like hooves, but not four, just two. And they weren't very consistent. I looked back and saw a tall thing almost limping very quickly towards me. It had long hair that was bouncing behind it, but it looked clumped together and very matted in the silhouette. I twisted the door handle, but it was locked, of course. Running around the side of the house, I was thinking, why would she lock the door when she knew I was outside? What if I got hungry or thirsty? But I quickly lost that thought when I remembered what was happening. I reached the front door and got the spare key. Then I unlocked it and ran inside, throwing the door shut behind me and locking it. I heard the now slow footsteps of the thing walking outside the window. Peeking through the blinds, I was able to get a good look at it in the porch light. It had very thin legs, with hooves. It definitely wasn't human, but I couldn't see its face, and I'm glad I couldn't. I thought for a couple of minutes, then I remembered that my mom had her cell phone, and I could call 911. I ran upstairs to my mom's room, but she wasn't there. Before I could even worry, something was pounding on the front door. I hid in my room for 10 minutes, wondering all the while, what do I do? Then I heard my mother calling me from downstairs. She was very angry. Apparently the pounding on the door was my mom, and she said she couldn't find the spare key. That's because I took it inside with me. She went to the nearest gas station to get some medicine for my sister because she felt sick. My sister had to crawl through the window to unlock the door for my mom. The creature itself was nowhere to be found. Only muddy hoof prints were left behind. I remember those footprints, which was enough proof to my mom that something really did happen, that my experience, though wild, was true. Sometimes my mom isn't very convinced, and other times I think she's in denial. But when something happens to her, I know we'll be living in those apartments again pretty soon.